Before diving into this incredible story, remember to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, every story has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. In Springfield, a quiet little town where everyone knew everyone else, lived a woman named Margaret Whitman. White, wealthy, cantankerous, and known for her arrogance, she liked to make her own rules, especially when it came to her domain, her sumptuous azure swimming pool. She spent her afternoons sunbathing and throwing private parties, completely disregarding the boundaries of others. A few houses down lived Ethan Johnson, a black man who owned the neighboring villa with a large garden and a methodical mind. For weeks, he had noticed that Margaret regularly used his swimming pool when he wasn't there, going around the gate and claiming it was public. Warnings, letters, and attempts at dialogue had all failed. Margaret laughed at his frustration, mocking him arrogantly in front of the neighbors. One day, after discovering that Margaret had thrown a huge party in her swimming pool, leaving behind trash and signs of wear and tear, Ethan made a radical and unexpected decision. He no longer wanted just to warn her. He wanted to teach her a lesson she would never forget. And so, with icy calm and a hint of mischief in his eyes, Ethan went to a center specializing in exotic reptiles and announced, "I would like to buy a crocodile." The salesman blinked in surprise. But Ethan knew exactly what he was doing. It wasn't a whim, it wasn't an empty threat, it was the revenge of intelligence and patience, ready to take the most improbable form. Ethan Johnson savored the tranquility of his home. Morning light slid across the cream-colored walls of his living room, and the scent of flowers from the garden mingled with the humid air from his swimming pool. But this peace was constantly disturbed by Margaret Whitman, his intrusive neighbor. For several weeks, Margaret had been disregarding all boundaries. She jumped over the fence, laid her towels around Ethan's pool, and laughed loudly with her friends as if she had every right. Every time Ethan tried to talk to her, she looked down at him with a condescending smile. "It's just a small pool, Ethan, you're being too serious," she had said during her last incursion, leaving behind empty bottles and traces of sunscreen. Ethan took a deep breath, trying not to give in to anger. He had tried every legal solution, even putting up signs, "Private pool, no trespassing," but nothing worked. Margaret seemed to consider her property as public land. That day, after discovering that his pool was still being used without his knowledge, Ethan made a decision he knew was bold. He didn't want to settle for letters or complaints. This time, he was going to send a clear message, something unforgettable. He went to Springfield Exotics, a center specializing in unusual animals. The staff, used to eccentric clients, had never met anyone as calm and determined as him. Ethan explained his situation precisely, without smiling, without showing the slightest sign of nervousness. "I want an adult crocodile. I want it to be able to stay in a pool, and I want advice on how to make it feel comfortable." The seller, initially shocked, opened his eyes wide. "Are you serious? A crocodile? Not an alligator, not a turtle, a real crocodile?" Ethan nodded calmly. His decision wasn't a whim. It was justice in its own way, a lesson for Margaret who thought she could get away with anything. As he signed the papers for his new pool occupant, Ethan felt a thrill of anticipation. He knew Margaret wasn't ready for what was to come. A few days later, a discreet truck pulled up in front of Ethan's villa. The engine purred softly, and two uniformed caretakers got out with a large, reinforced crate. Ethan was waiting for them, calm, but with a mixture of excitement and concentration. "So, it's him?" he asked, observing the cash register. "Yes, Mr. Johnson. He is an adult, in good health, and has been trained to stay in a controlled pool. You just need to follow the safety instructions." The crate was carefully placed near the pool, and the keepers opened one side. Inside, the crocodile's eyes shone like two emeralds, staring at Ethan with icy intelligence. Its scaly skin and powerful jaws testified to the animal's formidable nature. Ethan waved his hand and the crocodile slid into the water with astonishing grace. The pool seemed tiny next to its size, but the animal quickly adapted, floating gently and exploring its new surroundings. "We'll have to give it a name," said Ethan, giving a slight smile. "Why not?" Justice, suggested the caretaker, laughing. Ethan nodded. Perfect. Meanwhile, a few meters away, Margaret Whitman was finishing her morning walk. Her eyes fell on Ethan's pool. She smiled, satisfied, believing there was still nothing to stop him from swimming there again. But her smile faded when she saw the crocodile. The animal's eyes fixed on her. It didn't move, but it didn't need to move to make its presence known. Margaret instinctively recoiled, stumbling over the edge of the garden and clinging to her deck chair to keep from falling. Is that a crocodile?" she stammered, unable to hide her fear. Ethan, standing on the terrace, didn't move. He simply replied calmly. "Yes, Margaret. It's the new pool security." She remained motionless, shocked, as the crocodile slowly slid towards the water's edge, its eyes fixed on her as if to remind her that every intrusion now had a price. At that moment, Margaret realized she was no longer in control. For the first time in weeks, she felt fear and humiliation. And Ethan, with impeccable composure, knew he had just taken the first step in his revenge. The next morning, Margaret Whitman hadn't slept. The image of the crocodile floating in Ethan's pool haunted her thoughts. How could she dare cross that line again? Yet, her arrogance refused to give way entirely. She told herself that with a little ingenuity, she could circumvent this threat. Armed with her handbag and an oversized parasol, she positioned herself at the edge of her own property, directly across from Ethan's pool, hoping the crocodile would be out of her sight. But Ethan, sitting calmly on his terrace with a coffee, was already watching her. He made no move, letting the tension mount. Margaret then resorted to a little stratagem. She tried to distract the crocodile by waving a colorful towel near the water's edge. But the reptile, intelligent and attentive, turned its piercing eyes toward her and advanced slowly. Its movements were measured and silent, enough to freeze Margaret in place. Each step the crocodile took toward the shore seemed to gauge the woman's arrogance and reduce her to ashes. I can just take a bath, just for a few minutes," she stammered, hoping that logic would make Ethan give in. Ethan, without looking up, replied calmly and authoritatively. "The pool is private, Margaret. And now it's being supervised." Margaret felt a shiver run down her spine. It was no longer simply a question of ownership, the crocodile embodied the justice her own arrogance had unleashed. She took a few steps back, trying to save face in front of the neighbors who were beginning to look at her curiously. Hours passed, and Margaret remained there, paralyzed by fear and humiliation. The neighborhood children, watching the scene from their windows, whispered among themselves, "Look, she's the one who wanted to go swimming at Ethan's, now she's scared." Ethan, for his part, didn't gloat openly. He knew that subtle revenge was more powerful than visible anger. He simply sipped his coffee, letting the tension build, aware that Margaret had just learned a lesson she would remember for a long time. That day marked a turning point. Margaret understood that her arrogance had its price. And Ethan, with icy patience, knew that this was only the beginning. The crocodile, true to form, would make no unnecessary gestures. But his mere presence was enough to shake the pride of the woman who believed she could possess everything. Margaret Whitman spent the following night brooding. She had never faced such a situation. Her pride had been trampled by a mere crocodile in Ethan's swimming pool. She wanted to retaliate, but every idea seemed ridiculous in the face of her neighbor's icy resolve. The following morning, she went to her kitchen, determined to come up with a plan. "If I can't take on the crocodile, I'll take on Ethan," she thought, her gaze hard, her fingers clenched on the edge of the counter. Meanwhile, Ethan discreetly observed Margaret from his terrace. He knew that fear could lead people to make mistakes. Rather than rushing to answer her, he decided to reinforce his subtle strategy. He began to modify the pool area with new, secure barriers, aquatic plants, floating platforms, and some ropes to limit intrusions, while still allowing the crocodile to roam freely. Margaret, seeing Ethan calm and methodical, felt a fresh wave of frustration. She walked around the neighborhood, pretending to ignore Ethan's pool, but every neighbor she passed looked at her with amusement, some whispering, "She's afraid of the crocodile." Back home, she tried to alert the municipal center. "There's a dangerous animal at Ethan's house, it must be removed." But Ethan had taken care to obtain all the necessary permits to own his crocodile. The local authorities, knowing Ethan for his patience and adherence to the law, could only refuse to intervene. Tensions reached a boiling point when, that evening, Ethan invited some friends over for a barbecue by the pool. Margaret, unable to bear the scene, stepped forward to take a look, hoping to prove Ethan was exaggerating. But the crocodile, named Justice, slithered silently to the water's edge and stared at Margaret with almost human intensity. She jumped back, knocking over her handbag, and became the target of public ridicule. Ethan, still impassive, simply raised his glass and said, with a discreet smile, "Welcome to Springfield, Margaret. The pool is now under close surveillance." That evening, Margaret realized her reputation was now ruined in front of all the neighbors and that Ethan had found a clever and unassailable method of revenge. She didn't yet know that this first humiliation was only the prelude to a series of lessons Ethan had carefully prepared. Margaret Whitman could no longer bear the repeated humiliation. Every glance from the neighbors, every whisper about her was a constant reminder of her defeat at the hands of Ethan and his crocodile, Justice. She decided to take action. If she couldn't use Ethan's pool, she would destroy it, or so she hoped. The next morning, armed with her courage and a bag full of cleaning chemicals and tools, she crept quietly into Ethan's garden. Her goal, to sabotage the pool while no one was looking. She could already picture the scene where Ethan would discover her efforts and be forced to reprimand her in front of the whole neighborhood. But Ethan, always 2 steps ahead, had anticipated this kind of behavior. The day before, he had installed discreet cameras and motion detectors around the pool. Every time Margaret approached, a faint but audible beep sounded, making her jump and lose all concentration. Margaret tripped over one of the ropes Ethan had laid to secure the area and dropped some of her tools into the water. The crocodile, seemingly fully aware of the threat, slowly approached the edge and stared at Margaret. Its unwavering, intense gaze was enough to freeze anyone present. Ethan then stepped off his terrace with disconcerting calm. "Margaret, I think you've underestimated Justice, and me again." Red with shame and trembling, Margaret backed away and found herself outside her own property, unable to reply. The neighbors, who had been watching the scene from a distance, burst out laughing, and some didn't hesitate to comment, "There she is, trying to sabotage the swimming pool, and she's stopped by a crocodile." Ethan, as he calmly returned to his coffee on the terrace, felt a subtle smile form on his lips. Revenge wasn't measured by strength or violence, but by intelligence, patience, and subtlety. Every move Margaret made reinforced his plan, placing her further in a position of public humiliation without him having to lift a finger. That evening, Margaret vowed to find a new method. But she didn't yet know that each attempt would only strengthen Ethan's subtle yet undeniable dominance. Justice, the crocodile, was much more than just an animal, he was the silent symbol of a meticulously planned revenge. Margaret Whitman was determined not to be humiliated any longer. Her sabotage plan had failed, and she was now the laughingstock of the neighborhood. But her pride was too great to accept defeat. This time, she decided to use intimidation and legal threats. She hired a local lawyer and sent Ethan a formal letter demanding the immediate removal of the crocodile from his pool, claiming it posed a danger to the neighborhood. She hoped the threat of a lawsuit would be enough to make him comply. Upon receiving the letter, Ethan gave a faint smile. He knew his rights and had obtained all the necessary permits to own his crocodile. Rather than respond aggressively, he decided to let Margaret make a fool of herself. The next day, Margaret went to Ethan's pool with her lawyer to check the facts. She thought she would find a flaw, an illegal behavior on the part of the animal, something that would allow her to regain her pride. But Ethan, true to his strategy, had thought of everything. Justice, the crocodile, swam calmly, seemingly perfectly peaceful. He approached the edge of the pool and fixed Margaret with his piercing eyes. The lawyer, experienced though he was, paled at the sight of the animal, while Margaret instinctively recoiled, stumbling on the edge of the terrace. "I believe we have nothing to discuss," said Ethan in a calm but firm voice. "Justice has been served and I will not tolerate any intrusion onto my property." Margaret tried to protest, but her words seemed lost in the face of the man's implacable silence and the crocodile's gaze. Every attempt at intimidation backfired, only deepening her humiliation. The neighbors, now aware of the situation, watched the scene from their windows and laughed quietly. Margaret had tried to use the law and threats to control the situation, but she was clearly out of her depth. That evening, she returned home frustrated, humiliated, and aware that Ethan's every move was meticulously calculated. The crocodile was not merely a physical presence, it represented a lesson in patience, strategy, and justice that Margaret could not ignore. Ethan, for his part, was once again relishing his control of the situation. He knew that patience and intelligence were far more effective weapons than direct confrontation. And Margaret, despite all her attempts, still hadn't grasped that every action against him only strengthened her position. Margaret Whitman was now ready for anything. After weeks of defeats and public humiliations, she decided to launch a direct attack. Her plan, to break into Ethan's garden at night and sabotage the swimming pool, hoping to prove that she could regain control. That night, dressed in a dark coat and carrying a flashlight, Margaret crept stealthily towards Ethan's property. Her hands trembled with excitement and nervousness. She could already picture the scene where she would take control and show everyone that she was nothing to be afraid of. But Ethan, always one step ahead, had anticipated this possibility. The security cameras detected his movement and triggered a small spotlight at the edge of the pool. The light illuminated Margaret, making her jump. In the shadows, she then saw Justice, the crocodile, silently gliding toward the edge. His gleaming eyes reflected the light from the lamp like two merciless beacons. Margaret tried to back away, but tripped over a rope Ethan had put up to protect the area. She dropped her coat and lamp, and found herself completely exposed. Neighbors, intrigued by the spotlight, watched the scene from their windows, some even calling the police out of simple curiosity. Ethan then came out of his house, torch in hand but with a calm face, and said, "Good evening, Margaret. The pool is closed tonight, and I think you've already met Justice." Margaret, red with shame and trembling, recoiled abruptly. The crocodile, motionless yet intimidating, added a subtle but powerful sense of threat to the scene. She finally understood that her audacity had completely failed and that her arrogance had only served to amplify her humiliation. The next day, the whole neighborhood murmured about Margaret's nighttime misadventure. Ethan, true to form, hadn't done anything violent, he had simply used his intelligence and patience to transform an attempted attack into a public lesson in humility. That night marked a definitive turning point. Margaret understood, without saying so, that she stood no chance against Ethan's ingenuity and strategy. And Justice, the crocodile, remained there, a silent symbol of his owner's quiet but undeniable power. After her nighttime ordeal, Margaret Whitman was determined to regain her dignity. If she couldn't overcome Ethan through fear or intimidation, she would try to manipulate public opinion. She contacted a local journalist, hoping to create a scandal around the crocodile and the supposed danger it posed. The following morning, a curious reporter and his camera appeared at Ethan's gate. Margaret, standing proudly behind them, explained emphatically, "Look. He's keeping a crocodile in his swimming pool, it's a danger to the neighborhood. This has to stop." Ethan, sitting quietly on his terrace with his coffee, waved to them. He knew the story would backfire on Margaret. He politely invited the journalist to walk around the property and observe the crocodile in its pool. Intrigued, the journalist took several photos and filmed Justice, motionless and majestic, floating calmly. Ethan explained calmly, with supporting documentation. All permits were obtained legally. Justice is well taken care of and poses no danger to the neighborhood. Every precaution has been taken. Margaret, seeing the journalist becoming increasingly impressed by Ethan's discipline and legality, tried to intervene. But, he could attack. He is dangerous. The journalist looked at her incredulously, then turned to Ethan. "Everything seems perfectly in order, Mr. Johnson. I think your crocodile is rather impressive and well managed." Margaret blushed furiously, realizing that her attempt to manipulate public opinion had just backfired. The neighbors, who had watched the scene from their windows, burst out laughing. Even the journalist, despite his professionalism, couldn't hide an amused smile at the absurdity of the situation. Ethan, still calm, returned to his terrace and simply said, "Margaret, patience and preparation are often more effective than anger and arrogance." That day marked a new turning point. Not only had Margaret failed to intimidate Ethan, but she had also exposed her own humiliation to the entire neighborhood and the media. Justice, motionless and imposing, remained the silent symbol of a subtle but relentless revenge. Margaret Whitman, now red with anger and humiliation, decided to try one last strategy: legal action. She contacted a more influential lawyer and threatened Ethan with legal action for public danger and nuisance. She hoped that the legal threats would finally force her neighbor to back down. The following morning, a summons was sent to Ethan, ordering him to present his crocodile before the local court. Margaret rubbed her hands together with a triumphant smile, certain that this time, justice would be on her side. On the day of the hearing, the courtroom was packed. Curious neighbors, already familiar with Margaret's misfortunes, had come to watch. Ethan entered calmly, accompanied by Justice, who was being transported in a secure cage by professionals. His composure contrasted sharply with Margaret's tense expression. Margaret's lawyer tried to explain the situation by exaggerating the danger and implying that the crocodile was a constant threat. But Ethan, prepared for every argument, presented all the legal documents, safety certificates, and veterinary reports proving that Justice was fully supervised and legally authorized. The judge, impressed by Ethan's organization and composure, looked up at Margaret. "Ms. Whitman, it seems you were too quick to judge. Everything is in order and there is no violation of the law." Margaret blushed, unable to reply. Her legal plan had just crumbled in the face of Ethan's obvious and meticulous preparation. The neighbors, who had been watching the hearing from the public gallery, exchanged amused glances and ironic whispers. Ethan, still calm and polite, turned to the judge and concluded, "Your Honor, my only intention was to protect my property and prevent any intrusion. Justice has never been used to intimidate anyone, except perhaps to teach a lesson in respect." The entire room erupted in a murmur of approval. Margaret, humiliated in front of the court, the neighbors, and even the journalist who had covered the case, finally understood that her methods of arrogance and manipulation had all failed. That day sealed Ethan's victory. His patience, his intelligence, and Justice's mere presence had transformed Margaret's pride and arrogance into irreversible public humiliation. Weeks passed, and Margaret Whitman made no further attempt to approach Ethan's pool. Every neighbor now knew that trying to defy their neighbor or trespassing on their property came at a price, and that this price could be both subtle and terribly effective. Ethan, for his part, continued to enjoy his peace and quiet and his swimming pool, always accompanied by Justice, the crocodile. But he decided to make the lesson even more memorable. A big party was organized in his garden, with neighbors, friends, and even journalists, to celebrate the end of a situation that had become famous throughout the neighborhood. Margaret, curious but wary, watched from her window. She saw the laughter, the conversations, and, most importantly, the crocodile floating calmly in the water, now a symbol of vigilance and quiet justice. None of the guests seemed afraid. Ethan had demonstrated that fear was simply a matter of respect and preparation. Suddenly, a neighbor asked, "Ethan, he's scary sometimes, but he's incredible. How did you come up with all of this?" Ethan smiled, raising his glass towards Justice. "Sometimes, all it takes is a little patience, preparation and justice to teach a lesson to those who think they are entitled to everything." Margaret, for her part, finally understood that her arrogance had been her worst enemy. She never dared cross Ethan's garden again. The crocodile, motionless but imposing, had become the silent symbol of her defeat, and all those who had observed her remembered this story as an example of ingenuity and subtle revenge. Ethan's pool remained a place of calm and respect, and whenever Margaret passed nearby, she lowered her eyes, aware that patience and intelligence can be far more powerful weapons than arrogance or brute force. And so, in that small neighborhood of Springfield, the story of the arrogant woman and the crocodile named Justice became a legend, a tale of clever revenge, relentless patience, and a perfectly orchestrated public lesson.